Hey everyone, ready to dive into some seriously cool history. Today we're all about ancient Germanic warriors.
Those guys who went head-to-head with the Roman legions.
You got it. We always hear about Rome, right?
But yeah, their legions and togas and all that.
But what about the guys they were fighting? The ones the Romans called barbarians. What about their side of the story?
That's what we're looking at today.
And get this, we're talking about performance-enhancing substances.
Like drugs.
Yep. It's like something straight out of a movie, except this is real history.
It's a side of ancient warfare we don't usually think about.
I know, right? And we've got a bunch of sources pointing to this idea. Articles from Newsweek and Gizmodo, and even a scientific paper.
Really interesting stuff.
It all starts with some pretty wild spoons.
Okay, so archaeologists have found hundreds of these tiny spoon-shaped things at battle sites and graves all over Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Germany, Poland.
Like where the Germanic tribes lived.
Exactly. And they're from the Roman period, often found with weapons and other warrior gear.
So we've got tiny spoons popping up in warrior graves. It's gotta be suspicious, right? But couldn't they have been for like war paint? Weren't those tribes all about looking fierce?
Well, sure, but the size and shape of these spoons, you wouldn't really use them for cosmetics or medicine. They're just too small.
Okay.
And get this, a lot of them were found attached to belts, like hanging in a way that a warrior could easily scoop something up right before going into battle.
So they're about to face the Roman legions and they're like, boom, quick hit of something.
Yeah.
But what exactly were they taking?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. The research suggests they had a whole bunch of potential substances.
Like what?
Well, think about it. These warriors lived surrounded by plants, and they knew which ones packed a punch.
Okay.
Take poppy, for example. It produces opium.
Powerful painkiller, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It can also give you a euphoric feeling and reduce fear. Imagine going into battle with your pain dulled and your fear just gone.
Wow, that's giving them a serious advantage.
Potentially, yeah.
And then there's hemp, which I guess they use for textiles.
Right, but it also contains cannabis, which can have a bunch of effects. From relaxing you to making your senses sharper, maybe it helped them focus or stay alert in long battles.
So it wasn't just about getting high.
No, not really. It was more like they were strategically using these plants.
To manipulate their mental and physical states.
Precisely. They were using their knowledge to gain an edge in a life or death situation.
So we're not just talking about ancient battles anymore.
Nope. It's like they were biohacking their way to victory.
Okay, but wait, we've got poppies and hemp. What other plants were in their ancient drug cabinet?
Well, they probably knew about hops, too.
Wait, hops? Like the stuff in beer?
Yeah, same plant. Nowadays, we mostly think about the flavor, but back then they knew about the sedative effects, too. Imagine you're about to face a terrifying enemy. Some hops could really calm you down or even help you sleep, which is important when you're living in a war zone.
So it's like a natural relaxant. I never thought of hops that way.
It's pretty amazing what they figured out about plants, right?
Yeah.
And it gets even more intense.
Oh.
There's henbane and belladonna.
Those sound kind of hardcore.
Yeah, they can be pretty dangerous. They've got these alkaloids, hyoscyamine and atropine,
Okay.
that mess with your nervous system. In high doses, they can cause hallucinations, delirium, even paralysis.
Yikes. Okay, so not something you want to mess with. But why would they use them before a battle? Wouldn't that be a disaster?
It's a good question. We can't really apply our modern understanding to their practices, but researchers think they might have used these plants in very controlled ways. Maybe small doses for specific effects, like reducing fear or boosting aggression.
Interesting.
Or maybe they combine them with other substances.
Like to create some crazy concoction.
Exactly. They were working with what nature provided, trying to understand how these plants could affect them. And don't forget about fungi, too.
Oh, yeah, right. You're telling me they might have been, like, tripping out before facing the Roman legions?
It's possible, but what we consider tripping today might have meant something completely different to them. Those altered states could have been part of their religious beliefs, something that helped them connect with their gods or ancestors.
So it's not just about the drugs themselves. It's about their worldview, their entire belief system.
Exactly. These warriors weren't just simple brutes. They had a complex culture that we're just starting to understand.
This is seriously blowing my mind. Okay,
Yeah.
but how do we actually know any of this? Besides the spoons, is there any other proof? Like, did they leave behind ancient recipe books or something?
Haha, no ancient recipe books, unfortunately.
Pretty bad.
Proving exactly what they used is tough after all this time. But researchers are hoping to find residues on the spoons themselves.
Really?
They're doing analysis to see if they can identify any traces of plants.
Like ancient CSI.
Exactly. But even without that direct evidence, we can still put together a pretty good story. The plants they had access to, the way these spoons were designed, it all suggests they were using these substances on purpose.
Okay, that makes sense. But even if they were using all these plants, did it actually work? Did it really give them an edge in battle? Or was it all in their heads?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's something historians and scientists are still debating. But there are clues that suggest these substances might have made a real difference.
Like what?
Well, look at the Roman historical records. They talk about these Germanic warriors doing crazy things, feats of strength and endurance.
Like what kind of things?
We're talking about fighting for hours without getting tired, shrugging off wounds that would have taken down a normal person, stuff that seems almost superhuman.
Whoa. So were they just that tough? Or could it have been the substances?
It's hard to say for sure, but some researchers believe that those accounts combined with the archaeological evidence suggest that those substances could have played a real role.
So it's like we have all these pieces of a puzzle, but we're still figuring out how they fit together.
Exactly. And we have to remember that the effects would have varied a lot. The plant, the dosage, the individual warrior, it all would have influenced how they reacted.
So one warrior might be energized, while another is hallucinating and running around like crazy.
Exactly.
You gotta wonder how much those individual reactions affected the outcome of a battle.
Right, and we can't forget about the psychological side of it too. Just believing that they were taking something to make them stronger or braver could have had a huge impact. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
So it's a combination of the pharmacology and the psychology.
Precisely. It's a mix of factors that we might never fully understand.
Totally. But hey, if these substances were so powerful, why didn't the Romans use them too? You'd think they'd want that extra edge.
You would think, right? But here's where those cultural differences come in. Remember how we talked about the Roman view of alcohol?
Yeah, they weren't too fond of the Germanic drinking habits.
Well, Roman culture had a very specific way of looking at alcohol. It was for moderation, usually diluted with water and part of social gatherings.
Not chugging barrels of ale before a fight.
Exactly. Drunkenness was seen as barbaric, something that separated them from their more civilized enemies. So they probably wouldn't have wanted substances that altered their mental state in a way they saw as excessive or out of control.
So it wasn't just about the drugs, it was about how those substances fit into their culture.
Precisely. It shows how our understanding of history can be shaped by cultural biases. What the Romans considered barbaric might have been totally normal in Germanic culture.
It makes you wonder how much we're misinterpreting history because we're looking at it through our modern lens.
That's the beauty of historical research. It challenges our understanding and forces us to dig deeper and be open to new possibilities.
Okay, I'm totally hooked on this. But one more question. How widespread was all this? Was every warrior taking these ancient drugs before battle?
It's hard to say for sure, but with so many spoons found across different sites, it seems like it wasn't just a small thing. It suggests some level of organization and knowledge sharing.
So it wasn't just a few guys messing around with plants.
Right, someone had to gather the plants, process them, figure out the dosages.
So there was a whole system in place.
It seems like it.
Wow, it adds a whole new layer to how we see these cultures. They weren't just randomly throwing things together. They had a purpose, a method.
Exactly, and that's what makes this so exciting. It challenges our assumptions and forces us to rethink what we thought we knew about the past.
All right, I am obsessed with this. This has been a mind-blowing deep dive. So what's the big takeaway here? What does it all mean? What does it tell us about these warriors, about the Romans, about history itself? Stick with us because we're about to unpack all of that in our final segment. All right, so we've been talking about these ancient drugs and those little spoons, but what's the big takeaway? Like, what does it all mean?
Well, I think one of the big things is how this changes how we see these so-called barbarian warriors.
Right, like we always think of them as these big dumb brutes.
Exactly, but this evidence shows us a different side. They were sophisticated, they knew a lot, especially about the natural world.
Yeah, and how to use it to their advantage. Like, they had their own advanced systems of medicine and pharmacology, even psychology in a way. They were using these plants to get what they wanted.
Precisely. It changes the whole story, doesn't it? It makes us rethink those battles between the Romans and the Germanic tribes. Maybe it wasn't just about strength or tactics.
Maybe these substances played a role too.
Exactly. Maybe they shifted the balance of power in ways we never even thought about.
Yeah, it's like suddenly we're seeing these historical events in 3D. We're not just watching armies clash. We're seeing how these ancient drugs affected individual warriors, their decisions, their courage, their endurance.
It could have even changed the course of history. Imagine if a battle had gone differently because one side had these performance-enhancing substances.
Whoa. Like those tiny spoons could explain major historical events.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder what other secrets are still out there.
Right. What other things about the past do we need to look at again?
It's like realizing that history is so much more complex than we thought.
Totally. And that's what's so cool about archaeology and research.
It's always challenging us to think harder, to ask more questions, and to see the past in new ways.
I love it. So for our listener out there, what's the one thing you hope they take away from all of this?
Don't stop questioning what you think you know. Just because someone calls a culture barbarian or uncivilized doesn't mean they weren't smart. They had their own knowledge and beliefs, their own ways of seeing the world. And sometimes that can surprise us and challenge us and help us understand the past better.
Yeah, that's so true. And it makes you appreciate those little objects like those spoons. They might be small, but they can change how we think about history.
Absolutely. Never underestimate the power of a good spoon.
Especially on an ancient battlefield.
Exactly.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive, but I hope you learned something new.
And maybe it'll inspire you to do some exploring of your own.
You never know what you might discover. Thanks for joining us, and remember, history is full of surprises.